Hello, everyone. We changed our setup and then immediately suffered catastrophic technical difficulties. So let that be a warning. Don't ever do that. I'm not the pot scientist. That is Carter Baird. He's not here, or Carter's infamous temper. He'd totally fly off the handle. Anyone here know Carter? He's very calm and very friendly. I don't think he'd ever fly off the handle about anything. So he'd be like, "That's okay." And I'm like, "Sorry, Carter." Technical difficulties. I will occasionally just disappear behind the screen to manually advance my slide because, among other things, this was actually my fault. I forgot my remote. So anyway, this is Frank Talk. I'm Frank. Thank you all for coming out on our first Saturday. And I will try to see if I can remember some names. Anna, Michelle, Susan, Carolyn. I know I should know your name. Eric?
Got the right sound. It's Craig.
No, so, yeah, I'm dyslexic, right. Okay. Thank you to Herman's Hideaway and all the staff and everyone for letting us use this venue. Please purchase drinks, and if you're hungry, we have pizza, so yeah, feel free to have at it. We're going to talk about, among other things, we're going to talk about where the technology is with THC and impairment, and also where the law is, and they're actually in completely different places. And you're going to advance that? Do I have to flag you or something like that? Ignore the Cindy behind the camera. Yeah. All right, this is fear and impairment. So, does anyone here not use cannabis?
I can.
Okay. Oh, actually, I was going to bring up EMS because Diana works in EMS.
Actually, when I see
Diana works in a safety-related field.
well, and I work for the federal government. Their problem.
I used to work for the federal government, and I also had a dickhead boss who would randomly drug test me. So that is one of the things we're going to talk about because deployment law is very different from DUI law. You can test positive for marijuana in terms of metabolites because they use your analysis, but you don't necessarily, actually you're not ever impaired for your analysis test. I'm just gonna I can just manually do it. No?
It's there, Frank.
Okay, so raise your hand if this is your first Frank Talk. Okay, what is the first rule of Frank Talk?
Fight.
You have to fight, Michelle. You don't necessarily have to fight, and I'm not even going to force you to volunteer or even participate in any way, but generally people do. Next one. Cindy, I'm just going to manually do it, because otherwise I'll be all over the place. Okay, so other things, civil discussion, one scroll at a time. Just, we do have people sometimes who attend who are overly excited and are like, ooh, ooh, ooh. It's like kindergarten, raise your hand, wait your turn, that kind of thing. We'll kind of do a round table toward the end and have a discussion, and we'll have people pass things back and forth. If I don't know how to answer a question, I'll look it up for you afterwards, and if somebody else has an answer that's better than mine, share it. But just wait until we call so we're not all talking at the same time. Okay, other things. Backing shit up. This is a new field. There's opinions on things, there's science on things, wherever possible. I usually have a treasure trove of whatever research is currently available. Particularly on this issue, there's been about, I think, 20-page papers that have been put out in the last year by researchers on PubMed about what level of THC consumed daily leads to what level of THC is active in the blood, and it's directed specifically toward DUI laws. Because almost every single state that has a marijuana DUI law has passed an arbitrary limit that is like, above this level, you're impaired, below this level, you're not impaired. How does that reflect reality? This is the part where you can participate. No, the answer, like everything else, is it depends. It depends. No drug will affect everyone exactly the same way, at exactly the same dose, every single time. So 5 nanograms per mil is Colorado's legal limit. Is it hard or is it easy to surpass that limit?
Super easy.
Super easy. A lot of the papers that originally studied THC levels in the blood, particularly some that were even done like 10 years ago, they were using the University of Mississippi's source of marijuana, which has a concentration of about, I think, 5 or 6% for the high stuff. Right, they've got ditchweed. So they would have somebody smoke, they'd be like, oh, this person has a high dose. One of the papers that I pulled a figure from, it was actually a 2011 one, says, we gave people repeated daily high doses of marijuana of 20 milligrams of THC.
What?
Yeah, I was like, what are you talking about? That's not, never mind. Anyway, at that dose, when they gave people doses of that per day, many of them just simply would have failed that 5 nanogram per mil limit, and we'll get to that. First, we're going to talk about employment law and sampling, though. Actually, no, I guess first we're going to talk about metabolism of different things. Yeah, I'm not at my usual, like, run through my slides before this, because we were still fixing projectors. So, THC metabolism, most people are not aware of this, but THC metabolism, whether you smoke it or you take an edible, is entirely different. Goes through your stomach, goes through your lungs. Most people know that you get a different effect from edibles. You certainly get a different time point, but if you ingest an edible and it goes through your stomach, it will get absorbed in your small intestines, but only about 15% eventually will make it into your bloodstream. And most of it, at least 50% of it, is something called hydroxy-THC, which is more psychoactive than THC. Who knew that? Michelle did? Eric did? Yeah? Okay. So you have a different effect, takes a different amount of time, so 2 hours after you consume something, on average, it's going to get into your bloodstream, and you're only getting about 15% of the original dose, but it is more psychoactive. Next one. Versus inhaling it, could be minutes, could be virtually instantaneous. You inhale it, and it actually stays in its THC form because it's getting into the lungs, into the alveoli, which are little air sacs in your lungs, and by there it passes directly into the bloodstream. It will then go to the brain, it'll eventually get to your liver, get somewhat metabolized into hydroxy-THC, but most of it will turn into 11-carboxy-THC, or 11-COOH. 11-COOH is the stuff that's detected in urine, which is the primary way that your body gets rid of THC eventually. And carboxy-THC THC is not psychoactive at all. Go to the next one. Okay, so active versus inactive. This will become a little important later. I drew a much more simple diagram without any bodily structures, and I just had gummy bear or bong. They both will eventually go to your brain, but in the case of the edible, you'll have about a 50-50 mix of THC and hydroxy-THC, but eventually they will both get metabolized again by the liver, and you'll excrete them out in urine. Okay, so THC testing. Name the liquid. I think I labeled them. What's the one on the bottom right? Feces. You ever get asked to do a stool sample at work?
Thank God.
That'd be weird, right? Yeah. I was reading this Norwegian paper, and they approached that, they were like, even though you could do, theoretically, THC testing in stool samples, nobody wants to. They were like, there are logistical issues, and I was like, yeah, that's true. Can we go on to the next one? The other thing, too, which was actually on the bottom left, is sweat testing. So one thing which I'll touch on briefly is that there's been an entire cottage industry of companies that have been trying to come up with technology to do drug testing, because that's what the world needs, is more big brotherism, right? One of them is this thing called the sweat test, and the Australians tried this out. They swipe people with it, and it's supposed to change color if it detects the presence of drugs. It does change color. Is it because of drugs? It could be. It's actually because of a whole bunch of other things. We'll touch on some bad technology. Who remembers Hugo, Colorado, a couple months ago? There's THC in the water. Is THC soluble in water? No. One of these things, it was actually a saliva testing kit. I looked that up. It was a saliva test kit for Hugo, Colorado. Do you know the full story behind this? Why they suddenly figured out or thought their water had THC? They were trying to do a test on employees using a saliva-based test, and they were using tap water as a blank. And the tap water was showing up higher than the things, and they're all like, everybody panic. I think they did pretty well, considering some people actually thought their water was contaminated, but I think they shut down their entire municipal water supply for 6 days. Right, so okay, sweat testing's out, stool samples are out. Saliva testing and urine testing, for some other reasons that I'll get into, particularly as it relates to employment law, should probably not be used anyway, but they still are. Go ahead. Okay, so drug testing. Primary thing that they use for drug testing in the workplace is what? Based on the figure alone. Urinalysis. Urinalysis will detect the metabolite, the inactive form of THC that's excreted out of your body. In this way alone, it's probably the most unfair drug test of any of the drug tests. Opiates, I mean, it'll detect that recently, or at least relatively recently, depending on the user, that THC was used, but it does not actually detect impairment. So as the sign says, some companies, I've only had the misfortune of working for a few, will test you before they even interview you. They'll test you after they give you a job offer. They will test you in the case of an incident, usually for occupational safety, insurance reasons, to see if you were impaired. And what's that? So they can deny you health benefits. And oddly enough, in most cases, like urine tests don't actually test alcohol, and they certainly don't test impairment. So really what they can say is that you definitely had THC in your system at one point, but they never, ever, you don't get THC in your urine or metabolites for a short period of time. It actually takes some time to accumulate and build up, which means that it probably is almost never, ever an indication of impairment. But it's common, it's cheap, it's relatively non-invasive, that's why people use it, and financially, I'm gonna blame this on Craig, because they have a financial incentive to do so. But it's the most common test because it's relatively fast, straightforward, but it is also highly inaccurate. Go to the next one. Oh, Chad was like, damn, I had that shock color on last time. I've actually worked for the federal government before as well, or at least for companies that were contracting to them, but I've only come across a few that have actually required hair testing. How long does THC stay in your hair?
96 months.
Forever, or not at all. It's not forever. I had an entire slide based on this, and I figured it was actually too long, too technical, but the essence is that if you smoke, and again, it was actually a European company and researcher that looked at this, you will get trace amounts of THC in your hair. You'll also get trace amounts of opiates, and depending on who's doing the analysis, they can detect it reliably up for 3 to 3 months, and some people claim up to 6 months. It's probably not that accurate after 3 months.
Doesn't it depend on the length of your hair?
It depends on the length of your hair, but also whether or not they take a follicle.
And how far they go back?
So if they actually yank, they have this whole system of things where they like scientifically have the hair lined up along a ruler and they chop up little centimeters. Scientifically is probably the wrong word for it. The amounts that you can detect in hair, because it gets really, really low at that point, many companies don't even bother to use it.
Well, I went 90 days without THC. They did a hair test. I failed the first one. My boss told me to get something, a headshot called Root Clean. Washed my hair with it, went in the next time, passed.
And it could have turned up positive for a number of other reasons too. What a lot of these technologies don't, the Hugo, Colorado one is particularly good because I pulled the original validation papers. They said this has a high degree of specificity, and this was actually a European firm that did the testing. And they said this has a great deal of specificity, and I was like, what the hell's wrong with those people? It just tested positive for water. It can distinguish with high specificity between THC, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. That's what they meant. That's 4 things. It cannot distinguish actually with a high degree of specificity, including certain types of hair testing, between a whole bunch of other compounds. So you can get a false positive, you can get a false negative, could have been the shampoo you had and maybe you then got it cleaned out, but a lot of these tests that are looking for trace amounts, particularly in hair, and actually in urine, may not actually be that good at all. Saliva testing, oh, go back to the next one. Saliva testing is something that is kind of up and coming. It uses a lot of the same technology, at least for workplace ones, as urinalysis does, and it has a high degree of false positives. Yes. So impairment, as I said, is not assessed, but it was actually a saliva test that they were using in Hugo, Colorado that caused this entire scare. So this uses something that's called an immunoassay. It's got an antibody that just recognizes a certain molecule. But as we've been starting to find out, since marijuana has been legalized, many of these basic tests that are used to tell whether somebody is positive for use of THC or not end up binding to a whole bunch of other things. So particularly in the case of like color test, this is kind of an important point that I brought up with somebody, because people approach me often when they get a positive, hold on a second, they get a positive test result from urinalysis, and since we own a cannabis testing lab, they're like, I know I didn't smoke pot, how could this possibly happen? As it turns out, I was like, a couple of people asked me, including the person in the audience, for a friend. No, really, she was asking for a friend. But we had somebody contact me the other week too. There's a whole degree of things that are very common that can cause you to fail. Ibuprofen taken at a normal dose per day can cause you to fail. And one of these papers, their conclusion, they're like, out of 500 people, we only had 10 that had positive THC urinalysis results. And out of the 10 that were positive, 2 of them, going on to further confirmation testing, didn't actually have THC in their system. One of them was taking 1,200 milligrams per day of ibuprofen. A normal dose of ibuprofen is 800 milligrams. So you take 1, 2 of those or something within probably 6 hours of your test, you have a chance of failing urinalysis. It's not going to happen frequently, but the fact that it happens at all is not, if you're with me, a little wrong. Yeah, same thing with naloxone, which is Aleve, and one of the ones that I didn't know about, which has become more on the radar, even for Quest Diagnostics enough to make a point about saying it, is proton pump inhibitors. Diana, what's a proton pump inhibitor?
Cryostatic,
Yeah.
don't take them, they're implicated in dementia right now.
Don't take them for other reasons other than failing a drug test. They're bad. So they're for people who have like gastric, esophageal reflux disease, other things. The chemical found in them has a metabolite that once you pass it out of your urine looks enough like THC's metabolite that the test will just light up. So don't take them for a bunch of reasons, but in the event that you or anybody you know ends up getting a random drug screen at work or other things, and they're pretty sure they're not going to fail the follow-up test, have them fight it. Don't let them get fired and have that kind of put on their record, because there are a lot of different compounds that will cause these things to get false positives. Hugo, Colorado, they never figured out what that compound was, but I believe it was something from plant matter coming into one of their wells. They shut down an entire municipal water supply over this. So you can't tell me that this is uncommon. That's a town of 1,000 people who didn't drink water. They shut down the pools. They're like, no, don't get in the pools, you'll get the reefer madness. Really, they shut down the municipal pools. Even though absorbing THC through the skin at the levels that it was like. So clearly there needs to be more science here and more educational outreach. Next one. Oh, cannabis and driving. Okay, so employment law, general consensus, wrap that up. A lot of the screens that are qualitative at best are usually flawed in some ways. So now we get into a much grayer area. First thing, don't drive impaired. Everybody good with that? Whether you're tired, whether you're taking opiates, actually the one I hate the most is don't use your cell phone, don't text or play Pokemon while you're driving. I'm looking at Cindy. Driving while impaired is bad, don't do it. No one's typically in a position, particularly if they're impaired, to just assess whether or not they're impaired. If you think you might be impaired, don't drive. Then we get to the gray area. So the laws, depending on the state, vary widely on what is legally considered impairment in regards to THC. Colorado has one of the more, I'm going to say fairer laws, but it was developed before they really had the science around like what level of THC is considered impairment versus what is impairment versus like alcohol. Alcohol studies on impairment have been going on since the 1930s, really, and driving. Because people noticed soon after the advent of widespread use of cars, they thought that driving around in a 2-ton vehicle while drunk might need some laws against that, right? Could have had some bad consequences. So early transportation czars, I think if they even used that term, it was probably more offensive at the turn of the century. Yeah, the Russians and the revolution. Okay, anyway, I digress. They actually had relatively good technology and studies to even then look at the level of blood alcohol concentration and what constituted a risk. They used to have people blow into balloons, even in the 30s, and then they would measure the total amount of alcohol coming out. Now, alcohol, as it turns out, is not a very effective drug, and you need a significant amount of it in order to actually get drunk. Everyone know that? So, at the point where you're getting like even 0.08 or 0.16, your relationship of your blood alcohol and the amount that's coming out of your lungs is pretty well correlated, decades and decades of it, with a certain risk of accidents. It's pretty good science. With THC, no. Totally different pharmacokinetics, totally different metabolism for reasons I'll discuss here, and setting the limit at 5 nanograms per mil, which is pretty common in different states, may or may not indicate impairment. But I'll talk through some of the laws and which ones are better, worse, et cetera, and what the current case law is too.
I think it's worth
Good.
noting also the different types of impairment. I mean, one is completely debilitated physically, and the other is not necessarily.
I am not even going to touch on that in this talk. Craig was saying that there are different types of impairment. That's accurate. Well, actually, I guess I will talk about that in this talk. I'll get to that in a second. There's mental impairment, there's physical impairment. Alcohol has different levels of impairment. There's impairment of inhibition, there's aggression, all sorts of different things. What it really comes down to is, as much as possible, objective assessment of impairment. With alcohol, if you have above 0.08 blood alcohol content, there's enough decades of research to say you're pretty much guilty if that happens. Right. Or you're going to have a higher risk. Like, I think it's something like 65% higher risk of having an accident just based on blood alcohol alone. With THC, tolerance mechanisms are completely different, and I'll show you one of these studies on this in a second. Oh, but before I go anywhere, knowing your rights and applicable state laws are very different. NORML has actually accumulated and has a little map, so you can click on each one of these, and I'll give you a map that's kind of based on this in a second, about what state laws consider impairment and what's an automatic guilty versus a qualitative guilty versus what Colorado does, which is THC alone is not enough necessarily to make an assumption of guilt. Good. Okay, does this turtle seem impaired to you? Just a little bit. It's a turtle, he's not supposed to be driving. Automatic fail, you all failed that test. It's an impaired turtle. Anyway, so glassy eyes, these kind of things, these are all observations that could lead you to suggest that this person is impaired. They're a little slow, they're a little weird looking, his hands can't reach the steering wheel, etc. So determining impairment actually comes, the point of this slide is that it comes with a lot of different types of factors and not just THC. And I'll talk about a few examples of Colorado case law where people have had well above, because they were chronic pain patients, they had well above the legal limit, but they passed a roadside test in the way a person ordinarily would, and a jury acquitted them. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so driving under the influence laws, and this map may have changed slightly, and it will certainly change in November if certain states actually pass recreational and medical cannabis laws. And I think there's, how many are on the ballot now, like 7, 6? Yeah, there's like California, Arkansas has one too, which I was like, okay, go Arkansas. So in the states that are the red color, they have what's called zero tolerance laws. This is particularly important if any of you take a road trip and you smoke cannabis, because you will definitely fail if you get pulled over for this, even if you hadn't touched cannabis for like months. So in zero tolerance laws, typically any detectable presence of THC and its metabolites in your blood, in some cases in your urine, is enough for you to be guilty of DUI. Remember how long the hair test and the urinalysis test went out for? Months, weeks, etc. So in these cases, and I didn't pull up a lot of case law on these because it's, depending on where you're at, you're either screwed or you're not, and depending on your budget and whether you're willing to fight it. But that is the actual law in these states, is that detectable amounts of the THC, the main drug, which is intoxicating, or the metabolites that are not, you could be guilty of a DUI automatically if you get pulled over and tested. So take note of the red states. No, stay there. Yellow states. So yellow states have what are called per se laws. Per se laws are when they set a limit, and if you're above it, you're guilty, and if you're below it, you are not necessarily guilty unless a lot of other factors kind of converge. So depending on those states, you can have as low as 1 nanogram per mil, or up to even like 10 nanograms per mil, and that will determine whether you're guilty or not, automatically. But they do have that threshold, guilty, not guilty. This is the way alcohol-related laws work, that if you're above 0.08, that's automatic determination of guilt. Then you have what Colorado has, which is called inference laws. Inference laws relate in some ways to how prosecutors are able to talk to the jury. It's how, in Colorado, they could say this person had above 5 nanograms per mil of like THC. The prosecutor can say to them, to the jury, this means that this could have potentially contributed to why they're here today, but they can't say that it makes you automatically guilty. Now, Colorado designed this law because they actually had a lot of input from marijuana activists, to have this expressed specifically with at least a little bit of science behind it, because it is very easy to go over the 5 nanogram per mil limit, particularly if you use cannabis daily. And it may not necessarily dictate guilt, and they were wise enough to recognize that the science is not there yet where we can actually accurately determine it within a time period that may correlate with when that person's driving and with behavioral and motor and other things that Craig was mentioning that could relate to impairment. So in many Colorado cases where people have been pulled over for various degrees of reasonable cause, they've been acquitted by a jury because they passed a roadside test, which meant that, according to a relatively objective standpoint of impairment, they were not really impaired. Some cases they were pulled over and subjected to a test, or at least subjected to a test because they had cannabis somewhere in the car where it was visible. I don't think I passed that slide yet. If you are driving anywhere, put your cannabis in the trunk. Period. Or in the back of your car, somewhere where it's no longer in open containers, or even readily available to the driver, because that is enough to provide reasonable cause for them to search the rest of your vehicle. That's just good sense. Okay, so going on to what these mean. So zero tolerance, this is the exact wording in some of these cases. Most bodily fluids, probably even including feces, but you know they're not going to ask you to take a stool sample, because based on previous slides, in most cases that you are likely, and you don't necessarily have a say in this, except for, oddly enough, Arizona, you will have to take a chemical test of some kind, usually within a short period of time after they've decided to process you. So whether it's a urine test, whether it's a blood test, or whether it's a saliva test, it's enough to then push to the second degree where they're like, all right, we've decided they have THC in their system, and they may or may not get on to a better test like GCMS that will establish their guilt. Everyone nod with me if you realize the significance of that. You may not. Okay. Was recently an expert witness in a drug possession case in Florida, just as an example that kind of relates to this. The first test that they did upon intaking the alleged sample was to do a color test that is just as bad or even worse than the saliva and urinalysis test. And they said, this is a presumptive positive for THC. That trial went on for almost like a year, or sorry, they were filing motions for up to a year, and it turned out they never went on to do GCMS analysis of that sample. So they filed it based on a test that I've already told you was pretty bad, and they never went on to do the more extensive test to actually prove that there was THC in that sample. This was a single marijuana gummy. One. And 15 years was on the line there. One gummy. Right, so they kept that thing in evidence for about a year, and then they hilariously dissolved it in alcohol and ran it across their GCMS and completely destroyed their column in their machine, which I pointed out. So our client, that ended up not going to trial eventually after I talked to the prosecutor about that. Okay, so in many of these cases, in terms of presumptive positive, and particularly in zero tolerance states, if you know anyone that gets involved in any of this, and even lawyers may not necessarily know this because this is, again, still a really new field. If the presumptive positive was based on anything resembling urinalysis or saliva tests, it's not good enough technology, it's not even demonstrated enough technology to really prove this. Many people plea out as soon as they get caught because they're afraid of going to jail, they're afraid of the cost of fighting it. Tell them to fight it. In all cases in Colorado where people have fought, they've been offered plea bargains for impaired driving, but have passed roadside tests. A great deal of them actually passed. I've actually been acquitted, by a jury, even though they had 4 times the legal limit. So until the technology catches up, fight it. Where was I on the last one? Oh yeah, permissive inference is the statement for Colorado's, and what's called standard review, which is another way of saying like a roadside test for sobriety. Yeah, Catherine.
On the last slide, what were the white states? What were their status?
Thank you, that's a good question. Catherine was asking what are the white states in terms of cannabis DUI laws? Every state in the union has a law that you cannot drive under the influence of drugs, whether prescription drugs that are legal, alcohol, fatigue, cell phones, no matter what. So you can't drive under the influence, period. Those states have specific ones about THC in your bloodstream. But in general, driving under the influence of whatever is not legal, and, name it. You could no, you'd probably fall asleep. I'm sticking just to the DUIs related to THC. It's actually DUI, driving under the influence of drugs, I think, specifically. Then they have ones that are combination with alcohol, it gets really complicated really fast. These are the ones that specifically mention THC. That's why I brought them up. And I think NORML has an updated version of the laws that have passed since, particularly in border states around recreational marijuana states. Okay, driving under influence in Colorado at least. There are many ways that you can eventually run afoul of these things. There's sobriety checkpoints. I don't think I've seen one of those in years. No, I haven't. Maybe I don't actually get out enough. That might be it. That's probably true. Traffic stops for varying degrees of probable cause. Swerving to miss a turtle, walking around on the road, driving too fast, driving too slow, stopping in the middle of the road for no reason. Any number of reasons you could get pulled over for any number of causes is probable cause for them to at least stop you. If you exhibit any number of, there's actually a laundry list of these things. Like, if you appear too talkative or too friendly, that's probable cause that you're on drugs. I'm glad I don't get pulled over. I drive. I'm like, hey, what's going on? I grew up in Vermont. I talk to everybody. It's really suspicious. Oh, I did not know that. I'm sorry. Yeah, Cindy's like, I wouldn't have that problem. She's like, I'm not talking to anybody. They typically do if they believe, and in some cases you can be pulled over for reasons that are, relatively benign. You stopped, to look at talk on your cell phone, something like that. In the case, one of the cases I'm going to cite, the person was not driving too fast. They actually had no evidence of any erratic driving, but when the officer came over to talk to them, they did have a container or an envelope from a dispensary sitting in the passenger side vehicle. It was not open, but it was nearby enough. So then they gave him probable cause to search the vehicle, and they had her do a sobriety test, which she passed within reason. Like, anyone know anything about sobriety tests? I think this one's an interesting point. Who here can state easily, can recite the alphabet backwards? Are you fucking kidding me? Stand on one leg? I've actually got scoliosis, so on like one of my legs, that would be very hard to do without falling over. Many of these different types of tests, I think in this case, when I say like pass the test within normal reason, the patient has chronic back pain. She was not able to stand on one leg for more than like 1 minute. She's got spinal deterioration. And they're like, oh, okay, probable cause, let's do a chemical test. So her blood THC level of the active metabolites was 20 nanograms per mil. So she was 4 times the legal limit. She was offered a plea bargain. I think it reduced it down from a felony, but there was misdemeanor, 2 years of probation, that kind of thing, and she decided to fight it. She spent about like 10 grand doing it. She won, because the jury was like, they agreed that, at least some of the tests, she has a legitimate medical condition, she couldn't do at least some of the roadside components that were physical. She was not, nor did the officer say that she was erratically driving, and they're like, this 20 nanograms per mil was not evidence of impairment. So that's in Colorado, and that's because Colorado law actually allows that to go forward and allows the jury to consider that. Oh, stop, hold it. Yes?
So are there different rules or cutoffs or like exemptions for medical marijuana card holders? Or no? Okay.
Michelle is asking if there are different rules or exemptions for medical marijuana card holders versus anyone else. The answer is no, flat out no. That brings me up to mind a good example of a patient who's, you work for Comcast maybe? Dish Network. He works at a call center. He got hit with a random drug screen. He has some very, very severe illness. I think he might even be paralyzed. Case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and as the law said, this was actually related to employment law though. Even though they were only screening for inactive metabolites, and even though he's in chronic pain and he is not on opiates at all, the way the law stands is that he was taking illegal drugs. Because a lot of federal employment law supersedes state laws in many ways. And I think even in this case, state law does not address it at all. One of the points in Prop 64, or Amendment 64, sorry, those are different things, was that this will not affect employment law, and that even that you simply, if you get stuck with that, you get stuck with that. It's unfortunate, and I think some employers have certainly decided, I've looked at some articles where like they were talking to Quest Diagnostics, some of them have actually instituted different testing regimens so that they don't accidentally have to fire people. Because once they've determined that you're taking an illegal drug, they usually, for insurance reasons, have to fire you. Because then they'll be culpable for everything afterwards. So in his case, it was unfortunate, didn't work out. But in terms of, and this is one case where it's unusual, in terms of driving laws, if there's, the preponderance of evidence suggests that the person is sober, that they passed roadside test, they're not doing anything erratic, they weren't in an accident, it seems to be that case law seems to be going the way of the individual. Oh, and under Colorado law, this is an important point. They instituted a pilot program to test out different saliva testing, and they started doing this in January. It's voluntary. You do not have to accept it, and they're just trying to determine whether or not these things actually work like intended, but under Colorado law, they have to test whole blood, and I even made a mistake on there. It's not whole blood and serum, it's whole blood has to be over 5 nanograms per mil of THC. And because they can't do that at the roadside, it typically has to be within, in DUI cases for alcohol, it has to be within 2 hours of being processed. With cannabis, they have actually established no such time limit for it. And this could have either positive or negative consequences for people because, as I mentioned with edibles, they may kick in 2 hours later. So imagine if you got pulled over and you just taken an edible and it was 2 hours later, you could be quite screwed. So know your rights, know the law. This is not saying like do anything like weird or random or whatever, but like you have rights as citizens and as drivers. And this is particularly an area where it would be profitable for you to fight it off, even if it costs a lot of money. Good. Okay, so detection window for driving under the influence. So I have a couple of different slides, and this just relates to blood in the, this relates to blood detection. So there's 3 different types of metabolites that I mentioned. There's 2 of the active forms, one coming from edibles, one coming from if you've inhaled it, and then there's the inactive form. So depending on how much you smoked and for how long, you'll get a spike within minutes, usually within the first 60 minutes, and it'll rapidly decrease from there if you were smoking flower or something else. If you eat edibles, it typically takes about 2 hours for a buildup of 11-hydroxy-THC to build up in your system. And you will only start to see peaks of it within 2 hours. You're not going to see it much earlier than that. And you'll see some variations between individuals, but those are pretty accurate. You're going to see a spike in the inhaled stuff within the first hour, usually the first 30 minutes, and with edibles, 2 hours. You will see carboxy-THC start to appear after that time, even in the urine and even in the bloodstream, but it's the inactive form, and it will have no indication actually of impairment. Many people do not know the differences between these. We had a guy who was doing helping the renovations in our lab, and he was in an interesting position. He's kind of a dumbass. All by himself. No, he admits it. He's like, I am a dumbass. He had just gotten a new Jeep, and he was pulling donuts in a parking lot. Right. Anyone? I grew up in a rural state where there was plenty of things to crash into on purpose. We didn't have much else to do. So, Jeeps. What happens when you blow donuts in Jeeps? Frequently, they flip. And he rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled, and he happened to have his gun in the back. Let's double down on that, and a baggie of weed in the back. So he actually responsibly had the stuff more or less in the trunk. But when you roll the car, every cop comes along and he's in his driver's seat with a gun on the floor next to him and a baggie of weed. This did not look good. He was also Hispanic. So he's telling me this story and I was like, how did that go? And he's like, not very good. As it turns out, he did have a very educated judge. So he was tested, and they only tested for carboxy-THC, the metabolite. The judge actually knew the difference, and he's like, "Did he pass a roadside?" I mean, I guess he was crawling out of the Jeep, so is it really a roadside at that point? He wasn't on the road. The gun was legally his, and it was registered to him, so everything else like kind of turned out okay. It was his vehicle to be stupid with, and roll over. So as it turns out, the judge asked if they had looked at, for his bloodstream, if they had looked at active THC, hydroxy-THC, or just carboxy-THC. And as it turns out, they had only tested for the inactive metabolite. So he got a reckless driving charge. I mean, he drove around his Jeep until he rolled it over, so he probably deserved that, and he acknowledged that. But the felony charges for like drugs, DUIs, that kind of things were waived. But many people don't know the difference between these, so pass that anecdote around. Because if you get tested for any of these things, even though Colorado law, and this was after 2014, Colorado law is that you will only be impaired by this relative to the active form. That doesn't mean that it can't slip through the judicial system, okay? By the time it does, it may be too late for you or for people that you know. So in his case, it worked out because at least one person in the room knew that. Most people don't know that, even active cannabis users. Any of the rest of you know that? Just so I can get a gauge. Everyone's like, no? One or two? Okay. Next one, Cindy. This is my favorite one. So patients and habitual users. So these guys got to volunteer for one of the probably more fun studies ever. They, this is a research group that was based out, I think in this case, actually I read through 5 of these papers, I don't know. They took a clade of individuals who tested relatively low for like THC, like we're not habitual users, we're not even chronic users, and they gave them up to 20 milligrams per day for an entire period of a trial, and measured what are their blood levels of the inactive, the active, the hydroxy, and then what are their levels following after we basically stopped giving this to them. So you don't need to know what all the data is on here, just look at where the red lines are. So these were guys who were given 20 milligrams per day of THC. Now, even on the first couple of days, and they were talking about this being a high dose of THC, which again, 20 milligram gummy, anybody here, is that gonna do it for you? No? Good for you. Yeah, lightweight. I would probably feel one 20 milligram gummy, but certainly not for an entire day. So they got these about like once every day, like clockwork, and then they measured their blood serum levels. They also did oral fluid. They also measured the carboxy THC, but I wasn't gonna bring that one up. But in this case, they're looking at hydroxy, so that's an active form, as well as active THC, and how long it would stay in their system. So how long essentially would they fail a DUI? The answer is every single time. And they were not impaired, particularly after they'd been on this regimen for, what's the final day on that one? Oh, they cut off slide on that. They were on this thing for, I think, 20 days. So after 20 days, their levels, you can see where the ones are spiking, like in this rise like that. That was the second part of the trial. So at that point, I think they were probably, what is that, 80? Bad eyesight. Some of them were 36, some of them were 50 micrograms per mil. So let's go with the 50 because that's easy math. They were 10 times the legal limit for THC. They would have absolutely passed a roadside test, but they would not have passed a chemical test for it. So in somebody who's taking, I know people who are in chronic pain who have cancer and other things that are taking upwards of at least a gram of like THC per day. They can test at upwards, even 15 hours later, they can test way beyond the legal limit. I think the Westford even did a study on it like several years ago, and they've done several stories on it even this past spring. Now that case law is starting to come out, good news is, at least in Colorado, say what you will about the jury system, I was actually surprised that this was going as well as it was. In most cases where somebody has passed a roadside test, the jury has acquitted them if they decided to fight it. Yay. California is actually getting toward that same level. They did a case that was just settled, I think, about 4 months ago, where they actually decided, the jury based it on, California doesn't even have like a legal limit yet, and the jury simply said, you guys don't have a legal limit to say how much THC is illegal or not, and they acquitted the guy based on that. So finally, as bizarre as our entire country is going with our current election in particular, oh, vote by the way if you haven't, at least in terms of certain parts of the nation in cannabis legalization, we seem to be somewhat sane and rational. Even more so than Europe, by the way. You guys are like, what? I'm not even going to go into that. Europe actually has been trying to do the THC breathalyzer stuff for a while. Their limits, they actually still accept that as reasonable evidence somebody's impaired, even though it might not necessarily. So in one case, our justice system is less regressive than Europe. Not in a lot, but in that one in particular, we're okay. All right, next one. All right, detection versus impairment. So at least in Colorado, you can get what's called a sobriety check and a standard review, and in some cases, you can get vetted by somebody called a drug recognition expert. Who's heard this term before? This is kind of the new thing in terms of like roadside checks. It's somebody who has been specifically trained to detect. I was like, where's McCampbell? Tara. Tara and I were talking about this at the beginning. A drug recognition expert is somebody who is specifically trained to detect whether somebody is high or not. What do you think about that? Yeah, that's why I didn't put any commentary below it. I was like, okay,
How is that calibrated?
They run it-
how is that calibrated? They just know, okay? If you've seen any of the things on drug sniffing dogs, when they've done studies of them with large, there was this one that they actually put, I think it made national news. When they have done studies on their positives and then followed up on them, they show that statistically in many cases, it's not to say dogs are not good at smelling things, it's that if you're like, good boy, find the thing, they'll make some kind of alert. This is not necessarily, although it's definitely going to come across as it, this is not a criticism necessarily of the process that law enforcement uses. This might actually be in some ways better than chemical tests using an arbitrary measure. I'm going to stick to neutral on this one. Okay. Do your roadside test as best you can. If you're not impaired, you're not impaired. If somebody says, well, I noticed signs of this, this, and this person was talking to me too much, signs of suspicion, right? I would fail that test. I don't even use cannabis that often. Stick with that, go with the chemical test, try it up against a jury. So they're getting better and better in terms of like blood test and ability to actually test THC on the roadside. There's actually a lab in San Francisco that is now making a dual THC blood alcohol breathalyzer. It's pretty accurate, except in the sense that even though you can detect something, you may not necessarily detect impairment. And we are all very varied people, and are not, as normal individuals, we're probably all highly suspicious. Let's just put it that way. We'll use that standard. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, so correlation with impairment is definitely not straightforward, and particularly, I think I meant to put this one before that, no, I had the case law on this one. It's not necessarily straightforward, and in patients and habitual users, you will almost always exceed the legal limit, even for the active form. So the going, I think, window right now for somebody who's taking like probably 100 milligrams per day of THC is probably about 15 hours after their dosage that's been followed. They will still exceed by at least 4x the legal limit in Colorado. So I think, was it Dr. Shackelford? Anyone know Dr. Shackelford, marijuana advocate, physician? He did a couple of these trials, one of who was with a Westward patient, and followed them, measured by impairment, and they're like, this guy is not physically impaired, he's passed out his motor, sensory, CNS skills that would say that he's a sober individual, and yet consistently, at least at 15 hours, and they tracked it over like 2 days, even, always gonna fail that 5 nanograms per mil limit. So be aware of that in the event that any of you unfortunately get pulled over. Case of Colorado versus Brenninger, which was, she was acquitted it's not last year, it's 2016 now, 2 years ago. She was not really, there's no evidence of erratic driving. I think she was speeding, she got pulled over. She had a baggie from a dispensary, and she even works for a dispensary in a grow house, sitting next to her. They searched the vehicle. They called in 5 officers to observe and watch a sobriety test, and she got sent in for like blood testing, and she was at 19 nanograms per mil. Fought the trial. I think case took place over at least a year, probably a year and a half. And she rejected the initial plea bargain. She spent thousands of her own dollars, and I think some people volunteered to like kind of pay into her fund, but in the end, she was acquitted because the jury found no evidence that she was an unsafe driver in any way. She wasn't on her cell phone, she wasn't impaired by THC, and she did relatively normal on the roadside test. And there's scores of cases of like this. There's even one in Boulder for, I think, a 19-year-old driver that similar things happen to, and they're all usually about 4 times the legal limit. They're not typically finding people who have like excess and excess of that, but I'm sure it's a matter of time before that's gonna happen. Go to the next one. And how did I do on time? I think I'm exactly at 45 minutes. Okay, discussion.
So,
Hold on, let us.
Oh wait, hold on a second. I think we actually have a mic in the audience too.
So my question is basically based on personal experience with me. I can take 10 milligrams of an edible and be high as hell for 4 to 6 hours. I won't be driving if I take an edible. But if I take, say, a 1-to-1 edible, which would be, say, up to even 50 milligrams of THC and 50 milligrams of CBD, I actually don't feel any psychoactive effects, and I have pain relief. And so my question is there is, I think, an interesting literature that hasn't really shown up, or just right now anecdotal evidence about having THC and CBD in your bloodstream at the same time, and the CBD may offset the impairment issues that you see with THC. So is any state even looking at this, or?
Oh, that's like next level shit. The evidence that they have from CBD, to the best of my knowledge, no, to answer the question, because now I'm like, man, I want to talk about this forever now. To the best of my knowledge, no. And 10 milligrams, really?
Yeah.
I was like,
Five.
thought I was a lightweight.
I'm a very, very cheap date.
So, the evidence that they have so far suggests that CBD, even though it doesn't bind directly or even that well to the cannabinoid receptor, it probably binds to another receptor that's connected. They think the TRPV1 receptor, which none of you need to know what that means, but you probably will hear about it the next year. They think it probably binds to that, and in some ways, like, I don't know what the best analogy for this is. Think about, some movie where somebody shoots a bullet and the other person shoots a bullet and they knock it, ricochet off of each other. In some ways, CBD mitigates in a way that they don't understand downstream the signal cascade caused by THC. We have decades to actually answer a lot of those things. And I think that, going back to a sentence I made, and it comes up repeatedly when you look at this literature, the laws have been passed way ahead of the science. Even, the National Highway Transportation, the federal guys in charge of like a lot of these regs, more or less say your analysis cannot be used to judge impairment. THC and blood levels are like cannot conclusively be used to judge impairment. So does AAA. So AAA apparently does a lot of highway safety things. They're involved all over the place on. They said this does not necessarily correlate with impairment. So putting the cart before the horse, more or less. But many of these laws were an absolute requirement. The federal government put in place, who's familiar with the Cole memo? Everyone's like, more or less. The federal government said that in order to experiment with recreational marijuana, you have to satisfy certain criteria, one of which is you have to assure us you're going to deal with the potential for stoned drivers. So many, I think Colorado did the best on this, but I think California is trying to do the best on this. They made laws that did not necessarily, say, all right, this much, you're guilty, it's over, that kind of thing. So that's why they made the per se, or permissive inference laws. And it seems to be working out case law-wise. Because typically when someone is pulled over and prosecuted for DUI, reckless driving, that kind of thing, there's a preponderance of evidence often that they were in fact reckless driving. As my friend who rolled over in his Jeep. He was not guilty of DUI, he was just guilty of reckless driving. So I can't speak to whether or not there's an objective measure of whether somebody blending CBD with THC modulates their impairment. I suspect there probably is. I suggest we get some research on that. I know, long answer. Greg.
There's a book that's associated with one of the, his name, it's the marijuana botany book, but then there's a marijuana chemistry book, and in the beginning of that marijuana chemistry book, it talks about the relationship between CBD and THC in the group of 100 or so people that they did the testing on. Mm-hmm. And it shows that result that she's talking about, where closer to a one-to-one relationship, they tend to offset each other. That's why a lot of the CBT medications, I think, are in a ratio relationship.
I want to see the clinical trial paper on that.
It
reminded me actually.
I can find the book, and the book cites the references, but it's 70s and 80s material, but a lot of that was good research back then.
I was like, and a lot of it was terrible, but have you seen some of the NIDA papers? Like, causes psychosis and aggressive behavior, and I was like, by the way, did we mention we were treating prisoners with this? And you're like, I get it now.
I think you recognize the author of the marijuana botany book that cites the marijuana chemistry book in its list of suggested reading.
Yeah, no, I probably will. It's, joking aside, Europe has done some of the more objective and larger number, fairly objective work, because driving impaired is not okay. Doesn't matter what it is. No one should drive impaired. And they have, different levels of laws depending on which part you're in, but I think a Spanish study was actually trying to do as objectively as possible with driving, like here are your changes in psychomotor behavior with this amount of THC, and this is what can occur with it. And it's probably one of the few studies of its kind. If any of you want to do more research, I think the University of Minnesota or Minnesota State has actually compiled a lot of that. Just pull up a Google search for it, for like marijuana DUI in Minnesota, and they've actually compiled enough of it that you can kind of weigh for yourselves. It was way too much for this, and it was also very dry, as a state government publication would be, but it also has a lot of good resources on it. I don't think they addressed cannabidiol, though. That's definitely, people didn't even really think cannabidiol did anything until like a few years ago. Yes? Michelle.
Robert Connolly is the...
Robert Conley? Mhm.
Okay, so we have about 8 states having some form of legalization on the ballot, and many of them are recreational marijuana measures. So we're about to see, if they all pass, a tremendous amount more of legal marijuana users. And with that being happening, you're going to also have potentially more marijuana DUIs, because more people will be using and be open about it, and therefore, you know, when they're drinking and smoking marijuana, they're going to get, you know, have cannabis in their system. And so how do we deal with the possibility that now marijuana users, you know, we're going to be in there being, oh no, there's an increase in DUIs, but it's actually just, there's an increase of, you know, legal users in general. So there's always going to be people that misuse drugs, misuse drugs. So how do we, like...
Were you about to say misuse drugs properly?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. No, it's time for my marijuana as well. I'm a little in pain, so...
No, I think that the best way to misuse drugs is to take them and not drive, or operate any heavy equipment. I was like, that's not really a misuse, though. That's proper use. No, it's a good point, because Colorado, there's a lot of interesting statistics in Colorado where one of the things they noted in the first year after rec passed was like a drop in traffic fatalities. And then the next year, there was a tremendous spike. You know what also happened that year? 120,000 goddamn people moved to Colorado. There's something, when taking physics, there's something called collision theory. If you don't change the size of the vessel, but you increase the number of particles in it, they're gonna run into each other. It doesn't matter if the particles are drunk or high or anything else, they're going to crash into each other. That's what happens. Our highways haven't gotten bigger. And more people from Texas moved here. But I really like Texans, but their driving terrifies me. It terrifies me. Yeah. Oh, actually, no, my driving is the least terrifying. It's probably more annoying than anything else. I'm like, I'm wandering around. Citations will go up. I think Dan Rowland, who's a Denver spokesperson, Denver City County of Denver spokesperson, pointed out that they've only really started tracking. I mean, they've always sort of tracked DUIs that relate to different drugs, but now because it is legalized, they're tracking in a more systematic manner. So for a while, there's going to be an artificial jump up, but he said it very responsibly. You have to track that kind of data to figure out if you even have a problem. Now, if 75% of people in Colorado test positive for THC in their systems when stopped for a variety of things, or they were all involved in traffic accidents, but there was no evidence of lack of sobriety, they may want to go back and readdress the 5 nanograms per mil. I think that it's probable that they will. In the meantime, though, I'm going to keep pointing back to this because that was the only green state on that map. Case law seems to be working out. It sucks. It's an experiment. It's unfortunate for those people in particular. In the meantime, take Lyft, everyone, all the time, whenever possible. If there's any question whatsoever, just do it.
That's really good driver right here.
Yeah. It's $10, $15, whatever, to get around town. Fighting off a DUI, even if you win, is really, really expensive. Best next thing, because people have to drive, just be educated, pass this information around, because the thing that we found out, particularly in working with other states, when Cindy and I have as expert witness testimony, and even just providing technical aid, is that there's a lot of misinformation around there, everywhere, and that our legal system has been slanted for decades now, at least since the 70s, but even before that, as being very anti-cannabis. And people are afraid of going to jail. I would be afraid of going to jail. So when you get a plea bargain, seems like a good deal. Okay, I don't have to spend thousands of dollars, I get to do this, etc. Seems like it's all right. what people have to start doing, I know this is a super long answer to your question, Michelle, but it allows me to expand. What we have to do more as a society is have more science-based rationale behind laws. And I do believe Colorado is trying to do that. We're also trying to catch up on 70 years of a whole, in many different ways. Like the cannabidiol one that you mentioned is a super great example. Who knows where that's even going to lead? Because, God, what was this, something that Cindy and I were talking about the other day? Like, wouldn't it be cool if you could just take something and it would neutralize your high and you're totally perfectly fine? Does anyone know anything that does that? CBD. Terpenes. I don't even know how to pronounce this. I've never heard. Carafilene, whatever. It's the thing in black pepper. Friend Damien's like, all right, if you chew on black pepper, if you're super high, it'll make you not high. Who's tried this?
Nobody wants to do that.
What's that?
Nobody wants to chew on a black pepper.
Nobody's like, that'd be a waste of my misuse of drugs. Like, I bet Maureen Dowd wished she had known that. No, that joke's too far gone. She was a New York Times reporter and she came to Colorado and she ate too many edibles and cried on her. Apologies, she seemed like a nice journalist, but I was like, that's just as sensible as going to a shop, buying a thing of vodka and being like, I wonder what'll happen if I drink all of this. You may not know the exact specific outcome, but you can suspect that it was not going to end up okay, right?
Could assume severe intoxication.
That's just that's just common sense, come on. Yeah, so, I don't know. I think there's a ton of research to catch up on. I think that things like beta-caryophyllene, it'd be interesting to do research on that. They do have those little things like chill pills that supposedly bring you back, that kind of thing, but they know that at least beta-caryophyllene does bind to the cannabinoid receptor. And they've done enough research to show that it has a signaling cascade that unfortunately, there's limited research on this, but it'd be cool to see what the end outcome is, that you can actually nullify the effect of the cannabinoid receptors, or at least the euphoria part. Tara.
Kind of on a similar but very different area is dog testing. Like how can they, so I mean it's harvest season, I'm driving home with hemp all
Did you
over
say
me.
dog testing?
Yeah, like dog sniffing, drug sniffing.
Oh, it was like, what are we testing on dogs?
Dog sniffing dogs.
Yeah.
From my knowledge, I think they do smell beta-caryophyllene. It's not THC that they smell. So how with hemp versus marijuana, like if you're driving with over 2 ounces of hemp in your car and you get pulled over, are they going to detain you?
Oh, complicated question. Were you here for the CBD isomerization talk?
Yes. I
Yeah.
was wondering in terms of law, like how are they able to tell, like if they have a dog in their car and they walk around your car and it says, okay, there's something, they're going to obviously search your car and you're obviously stuck while they do that.
I think it really probably, Greg says, it depends on whether you're in Indiana. I was like, I should pull that map back up. It depends on the jurisdiction. I'll say though, even in states where it's not become legal, I think they said something like, across the United States, 65% of adults think marijuana should be legal. We went through a really regressive period. Who here was born before 2000? Okay, just checking. So you guys, that was like 1990s. There was a period in the 90s where particularly, punishment for certain types of crimes, I mean, it actually started in the 80s, then really escalated in the 90s, super predators, whatever. Where a lot of regressive laws that particularly affected African Americans were passed and put them away for a very long time for minor drug offenses. People are now finally at least starting to I try to be optimistic because very often as a scientist, I'm not. So I'm like, science is like, very Nietzschean, hope is the worst of all evils in science because it prolongs the pain of the scientist. You never hope anything is going to work. I do hope, and I think there's enough evidence for this, that drug laws are either getting passed, and particularly for like cannabis possession, is being decriminalized, even in states where it's not legal. The fact that southern states... Wait, now I have no idea where you're going with that.
I'm saying New York decriminalized up to 2 ounces as a misdemeanor, or all of Pennsylvania decriminalized up to 2
Yeah.
ounces as a misdemeanor. So So even without voter initiative, those states have taken the legislative authority.
Right, because they've recognized that it's adversely penalizing their citizens. So, Tara, to go to your point, if you have hemp, make sure it's clearly labeled, have a bill of lading if you have it. Don't have it in the front of your car. Take a look at that map and look at those red states and drive all the way around them.
I would get testing done on it, on that batch prior to transporting it. Bring your testing results with you and the batch record and everything. Create a manifest through MED if you have to, if you have that ability.
It's hemp, so this would.
That's true.
It's not a metric.
Make sure that the THC is clearly labeled as low enough to be outside the threshold.
Yeah, but I mean, like, you're just driving home and you have,
I think in Colorado, I have no idea what the perspective on this is, but like, going back again to like my experience in other states where I was shocked to find that marijuana was still illegal. I haven't actually taken my head up from work in a couple of years, and I was like, marijuana is still, people go to jail for that? I was like, that's weird. This is a marijuana gummy too. I think in many cases, but particularly in Colorado, where it's been decriminalized or it's legal, most law enforcement officers, I know we all see stories in the media that says, oh my God, this person did this. There are obviously some problems there. Most law enforcement officers are concerned with risk to life, limb, health, and enforcing laws. That is their job. In states like this, I have not heard of anyone, no, that's not true. I have heard of only limited circumstances where they've had some difficulties, where they've had potentially over the legal limit to possess. I haven't heard of anyone going to jail for it. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but I think if keep your head about you, remember your rights, see how it goes. But yeah, if you're concerned about that and you're transporting a bunch of like industrial hemp, upon testing it should never have enough THC in it to really pass, or really to fail the limits for what distinguishes like flower, at least, from like from marijuana flower. On the other hand, like cannabidiol oil, I know at least one person in this room who's directly seen this, who's not me. We had a client who was shipping stuff. They were actually extracting cannabidiol back and forth, and they were selling across the United States, which is legal. And one of their clients sent it back because I presumed that they had stored it incorrectly. And this thing was now several percent THC, whereas when I tested it, it was 0.1%. So in those cases, I would simply say you're probably thinking about all the options. You're probably in far more danger from going across state lines where it's not legal in any way whatsoever and getting tied up in some sort of snafu than you are within the state. And I know that there's still a lot of things to figure out with hemp because people don't really quite understand how it works versus marijuana, but most things, if you persevere and to know your rights and are well educated, you can usually win with science. I'm fond of winning with science. We're doing well with it so far, particularly in cannabis. Anyone? Oh, Diana? You're pointing somewhere else.
So my questions are probably more naive, but going back to drug testing. I eat a lot of health foods, and I like to put additives in my smoothies. I picked up one recently that was savory, and it had hemp in it. And I'm like, I'm so mad. It's like, I'm fucking 54 years old. Fuck you, I'm a responsible citizen. You know, so I put it in there, and then later went, what if they decided to random me at work?
You have a chance of failing.
Oh, nice. I had some this morning, it was great. Anyway.
Yeah, there was a paper done, interestingly enough, I think it was by the Navy. No, it was the Navy, where they went through, it was 10 years ago, but they wanted to know what the likelihood of service members failing a drug test, because they do random screens. And they bought, I think, something like 50 products on the market at that time, and those things really were, this is before anyone who really was knowledgeable at all about cannabidiol. And they said that there were some cases where someone would very definitely, if they were having a high amount of like hemp seed oil, they'd fail a drug test.
There we go.
then apparently I should just add poppy seeds while I'm at it.
No, you definitely should.
You know,
The
that's
chances
a
of
joke, however.
the chances of failing are low, but as we had some, this is an unfortunate anecdote, but it's also it's a very educational one. So we had someone ask us about the fact that they had failed a drug test at work and it was just a urinalysis screen. And this is one of those cases where it was like, ouch town, population U, bro. It was like, I was like, that sucks. He failed a urine test, and he was one of the people who was on a proton pump inhibitor. But until I actually looked up more, because I was like, what are you taking, this, and I was like, I hadn't even heard of that before 6 weeks ago. I was like, that sucks. So he failed the urine test, and he had not been smoking or doing anything for over 2 months. And so this was part of like he was going from a temp to a full-time hire, and that's why they did the drug screen, and he thought he was going to pass the piss test because he should have passed the piss test. He was almost in the end of that 3-month window where even in really, really chronic users, he probably still should have passed. The problem was that on that initial fail, which probably was a false positive, they then did a hair test, which he definitely failed because they can go back 90 days to 6 months. So if it's ever something that's a concern, I would say for people who work in what are called safety fields, so emergency medicine, the chance of you getting screened for something, the chance of having an incident at work is way higher anyway. And then the chance of them screening you, because like patient attacks you, you fall, you get workman's comp because you hurt your back, that kind of thing, the odds aren't very good.
They went as far as more providers were talking to their patients about alternative pain uses and marijuana and recommending it to them. And so they changed our policies from random, which they would have to just draw your name out of a hat basically, to whatever the fuck they want is what I call the policy. So they can, with any suspicion or no suspicion now whatsoever, test us whenever they want. I'm kind of weird at work, so I'm sure I'm high on their list.
You're kind of weird outside work too.
That's true.
I've known Diana for years, I can say that.
Anyway, there's 2 other quick exposures that I'm curious about. Topical.
Interesting. What's your question? Would it cause you to fail a drug test?
Yes.
Yeah.
I figured so,
Yeah.
but I wondered. And then I've heard maybe it's
Probably.
an urban legend about this, because we've talked about it at work, and I work for sort of a military institution. Being around your friends while they're smoking.
Oh, that's my favorite question.
And I was told, this is the urban legend I was told, the military kept hearing those excuses so often, they decided to put a whole bunch of soldiers in a car and just fucking clouded over, so you couldn't even see in the windows. And
That sounds like something the military would do.
So I'm curious, urban legend?
No, it's true, but as somebody pointed out, and it was Europe gets to do a lot of fun research we don't get to do yet. They wanted to see how much exposure you could really get depending on, they had people like in the same room and they exposed them to a set amount of smoke, set amount of THC, whatever, and they were puffing the stuff in there. I think the most well-reasoned answer I saw was that yes, you can test positive from secondhand exposure, but not incidentally. You would know you're being exposed. So if you're in a position where people are smoking pot around you,
I usually inhale.
you usually inhale. Yeah. His point was that if it's a concern, if you can smell it, there's a likelihood that it's going to cause you to fail a drug test, because what he had was people like in a reasonably well ventilated room, 20 by 20, and half of them were smoking, half of them weren't. They were on the other side of the room, and they failed urinalysis. They weren't high, but they had enough that they failed that, and they failed hair test. Yeah, but his point was, he's like, if you can smell it, move away. Anyone else? Before we wrap things up. Yes?
Like juicing leaves, hemp protein, hemp seeds, all the stuff that you could potentially put into a health drink. Are those, potentially, is it there?
It depends. The study I pointed out about the Navy testing those products was back, they were using extremely low THC products. hemp nowadays, because cannabidiol itself, like particularly if you're ingesting it, stomach acid is enough to convert over small amounts of cannabidiol to THC. And some of the metabolites, depending on the person doing the testing, urinalysis tests, some of them distinguish between THC and CBD. Some of them you test positive, like Hugo, Colorado. You got stuff, yeah. The answer is it depends. I think it's unfortunate people get subjected to that kind of testing, but I would say that a lot of hemp products nowadays, particularly because now that CBD is kind of a new thing and it's known to isomerize over to THC, there's definitely a risk that you could fail a drug test based on that alone.
Well, there's quote-unquote hemp that's at like 18% CBD with giant crystals all over it.
Yeah.
And it's flour, no escaping it. It's just
Yep.
high CBD flour.
And CBD converts to THC. Higher degrees or lower degrees, depending on what happens with it. But no, in the end, I mean, God, there's got to be more rational, science-based studies on this, and that employers got to stop being. Actually, I think part of the problem is that Quest Diagnostics is like, you can test your employees for everything. Really. They used to, there was a company next to my old business that I worked for, which I don't anymore, but like, you would always see the Quest Diagnostic narc car driving in. This is the guy who would come in, he would come in to go, pass around the cups for everyone to pee on, and then he would watch you pee. I suppose for the right sort of individual, that would be their dream job, but yeah. Sort of answers your question. It's a risk if you've got an employer who's really slap happy about that kind of thing, but I think as another person put it, like if you are in a position where you have an employer who is constantly trying to catch you doing stuff that you're probably doing on your own time anyway, maybe find a different employer.
Can I ask a question for you real quick?
No, Chad. Everyone but you.
So as a bartender, I get asked all the time, probably once a week from a friend, whether it's on Facebook or social media, anything like that, or a drug test. So if I could run down a list, can you give me your quick couple word feedback in regards to trying to combat a work test urinalysis? First would be flushing your system with a whole bunch of water.
The best way is to abstain in the first place.
Okay.
No. THC is not soluble in water.
Okay. What about cranberry juice?
Well, doesn't work at all.
Doesn't work at all?
No, and going to the flushing water part, a component of most types of urinalysis is what's called specific gravity. If the urine is too dilute, that's an automatic fail or retake.
Okay.
Period. And that's a common component of those. The other one, which I can anticipate, is that people are like, what if I just pour some bleach in there?
Yeah.
They look for that too.
Okay.
One of the slides that I had on this was that I don't advocate anyone doing anything random with these tests. The truth is, even though, I acknowledge the difficulties. I worked for a boss who would randomly drug test me when I came back from Burning Man. And I think I'm the only person at the company who was ever drug tested. My boss was a dick. I abstained from cannabis for 3.5 years because I knew that my boss was a psycho. I also knew as a component going into that job that because we worked with government grants, actually military grants, they were allowed to do that. And because employment's at will, refusing to take a drug test was grounds for dismissal, and just wasn't worth it to take the risk of failing. If anyone trying to get around all those kind of things, like you're going to spend all that time doing that, it sucks. Abstain. Drink alcohol for a while. I don't know. I know people are like, that's not interchangeable. It's not a perfect answer. Don't really have one. Most of the different types of ways that people have tried to tell me about how to get around different types of piss tests, if you're only an occasional user, you're probably going to pass anyway, based on the windows, 3 to 7 days. If somebody is constantly randomly trying to catch you, they're going to catch you. Catherine.
They've got something called urine lock. It's synthetic urine. You can get it at a head shop, and it comes with a little warmer that you wear. And you just take it up there right before you go and dump that in there. Make sure it's warm enough, and you'll pass.
Synthetic pee.
Synthetic pee.
What do you think about?
I should get some of that and actually pour it on some of the thing is, well, let me address this in particular though, before we can get to that point. Urine tests are so bad because there's so many things that can cause false positives. I mean, the fact that they're still used is ridiculous anyway. Go back to the Hugo, Colorado example. There's THC in the water. There's probably more compounds that you can take, which you definitely can't avoid, that are probably going to cause you to get a positive piss test than cannabis.
Meanwhile, I'm dumping fentanyl and caffeine around these things every day at work.
But those are legal. People are dying of opioid overdose. No medical value. Chad, did I answer your questions though?
You did great. There's so many of them. There's so many different, wives' tales as far as being able to pass this or pass that. And honestly, the only thing I've ever heard is synthetic or having one of your friends that has clean pee for sure. Yeah, you have to make sure that it's warmed right. That's all that I've been told. So.
Yeah, and I genuinely empathize with people who are kind of put in that position because, come on, like, really? Okay, any other questions? Gonna wrap up, have a drink, hang out, and thanks for coming to Frank Talk.
Thanks all.
Tip your bartender. Go and vote. Seriously, go vote. I don't think any of you are voting for Trump. Not that I'm advocating one candidate over the other, especially the one I hate, Hillary Clinton, who I'm voting for anyway.
Vote for the nutritionalist party.
What? No. Vote for Colorado to become its own country.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
I'm with you on that one, friend.
Sometimes it feels like the weight of the world falling on your shoulders. Sometimes you feel like you're ready to give in. It's up to you if you wanna break through, but you're getting older. Take my advice if you're ready to begin. If I were you, I'd tell you what I'd do. Move forward, don't look back. If I were you, I'd tell you what I'd do. One foot in front of the other, one after another. One foot in front of the other, one after another. One foot in front of the other, one after another. One foot in front of the other, one after another. I know that you've got the knack, but you can't look back, or you live in a memory. Let go of the past and you'll embrace the mystery. You're taking your best foot forward, moving toward all that you've ever dreamed. One foot in front of the other is all you need. One foot in front of the other, one after another. One foot in front of the other, one after another. One foot in front of the other, one after another. One foot in front of the other, one after another. If I were you, I'd tell you what I'd do. Move forward, don't look back. If I were you, I'd tell you what I'd do. In front of the other, one after another. One foot in front of the other, one after another.
Hey, I'm Macy Slade. Yo, I'm Edsel from the band Dope. Edsel Dope. You're watching World Viral TV. Turn it up. There you go.
So what is Extract Craft? It's an appliance you can easily use at home to create concentrates and medicines. You can even cook with it. The source was designed with the home user in mind. Now you can safely extract cannabis oil and make your own concentrate at home without blowing up your house. The source is the world's first at-home essential oil extraction and concentrate appliance. You can order yours at extractcraft.com/store. Use coupon code WorldViralTV to receive free shipping at checkout. Okay, so you can get recreational marijuana for fun, but some people need the medical benefits of cannabis. Know someone that needs a medical card? You can save money by simply seeing the right affordable medical marijuana doctors, Herbal Health Systems. You can book an appointment online at herbalhealthsystems.com or call 303-237-1223. Herbal Health Systems, herbalhealthsystems.com.
I wanna sell every piece of you. I just love the way you move. World Viral.
Motel Minute. Motel Minute. Hi, Mom, I love you.
World Viral.
This is Brent Loveday at Reno Divorce, and I'm watching World Viral TV.
All your past indiscretions don't really mean a thing. I think we both might have learned our lessons, cause now they barely sting. It's true that you don't know what you've got until it's gone. I don't care, I just wanna play, even if it's as your pawn. I was on the ropes and hurt when I finally realized that in this game the pain is worth the price. And I won't say no. You wanna give me another try? I won't say no. You don't need an alibi. I won't say no. Not like the way I did before. I won't say no. Cause I can take a little more. I won't say no. I'm gonna keep the thoughts that creep in the back of my head. I don't believe for a New York minute that you meant the things you said. It's true that you don't know what you got until it's gone. I don't care, I just wanna play, even if it's as your pawn. I was on the ropes and hurt when I finally realized that in this game the pain is worth the price. And I won't say no.
What's up, it's Tom Maxwell.
This is Brady.
We're from the band
Hell Yeah.
And we are here at
World Viral TV.
Brought to you by Colorado Harvest Company.
That's right, check
Get
it out.
some, man.
Yeah!
Perfect.
World Viral. Let me play you a song. You've never heard this band before, but they're the best one around. So you like the song? Well, now I don't. I'm over them. I think they're selling out. Maybe I'm just miserable. Maybe I'm miserable. I'm just so miserable because I'm in these jeans. My jeans are so tight. My jeans are so tight. My jeans. Let's go to the thrift store. We'll be original, buying clothes no one wants to wear anymore. And let's go to a dive bar. We'll drink watered down beer and try to find out who we are. And we'll wonder if we're miserable. Maybe we're miserable. I'm just so miserable because I'm in these jeans. My jeans are so tight. 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 My jeans. I need ambulance. I don't have the rhythm, don't know the blues. Just play my guitar and stare at my shoes. And I do not care if it's 90 degrees. Got a beard with flannel and a dummy knee. And the rims of my glasses are thick and black. And my band looks like annoyed lumberjacks that don't give a damn if you like our songs. You were probably right, but we know you're wrong. Cause your music tastes not as smart as mine. Doesn't have a singer with a high-pitched whine about political points that you're sure to miss. So I'll just drink my beer that looks like a piss. Cause I'm miserable, yes I'm miserable. I'm so miserable, yes I'm miserable. I'm so miserable, yeah I'm miserable. Because I'm in these stupid tight-ass girly jeans. My jeans are so tight. 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 My jeans. Maybe I'm miserable. My jeans are so tight. Maybe I'm miserable. My jeans are so tight. My jeans. Oh, I'm so confused. I don't know what to do. I don't even know if I'm aroused by you. Cause my jeans, they're tight.
baby, I get reminded of I used to run from love. Baby, 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 oh baby, then you show right on up, must be from up above. Now we'll never be alone, big as our love has grown, more than we've ever known, more than I could ever show you. But I'm gonna give you more, I'm gonna give you more and more, as we're walking through the phases of love. I'm gonna do you right, I'm gonna be right by your side. Nothing will contain us when I walk with your love. Baby, 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 oh. Oh. Maybe, 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 oh maybe, ours is the type of love the world's been dreaming of. Baby, 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 oh baby, when that rocky road gets rough, I'll be there to lift you up. Now we'll never be alone, big as our love has grown, more than we've ever known, more than I could ever show you. But I'm gonna give you more, I'm gonna give you more and more, as we're walking through the phases of love. I'm gonna do you right, I'm gonna be right by your side. Nothing will contain us when I walk with your love. I'm gonna give you more, I'm gonna give you more and more, as we're walking through the phases of love. I'm gonna do you right, I'll always be right by your side. Nothing will contain us. 2, 3. I'm gonna give you more, I'm gonna give you more and more, as we're walking through the phases of love. I'm gonna do you right, you'll always be right by my side.
Hey, it's Pat Searcy down here at National Speaker and Sound on South Broadway. Come down and see us. We're now carrying Charvel, EVH gear, along with Mesa Boogie, Paul Reed Smith, Nash guitars. Come check us out, mention World Viral, get 10% off.
If you're getting high in Colorado today, enjoy it.
Colorado Harvest Company.
Colorado Harvest Company. Colorado Harvest Company. Colorado Harvest Company. Colorado Harvest Company.
World Viral.
Okay, so it has been approved that we can say the fuck word.
Yeah, you just did.
Okay.
All of the United States is looking to Denver, Colorado to see what is cool. You know, it used to be maybe California back in the day or maybe New York early along, but now everybody's really looking to Denver, Colorado to figure out what is cool. And when you get accepted by Colorado as cool, well, then it just spills over to the rest of the world.
You have to see the vision for this area on South Broadway. This area, 5 years from now, is going to look very different than it looks right now.
Right. Not supposed to film me giving my tools of the trade. Like I know
Tools of the trade?
Yeah.
Separate segments?
Separate segments when you do it. Always ID yourself. Say,
Hey, this is Bubba Sparks, baby, and you're watching World Viral TV. You better know about it.
World Viral.
Anxious, baby. Yeah. Well, it's the 3.5, 14, 28, 112, 48,000 on the scale. That's the 8.5 ounce, quarter pound, and a kilo. 8.5 ounce, quarter pound, and a kilo. 3.5, 14, 28, 112, 48,000 on the scale. That's the 8.5 ounce, quarter pound, and a kilo. 8.5 ounce, quarter pound, and a kilo. It says thou shalt fear no man but God, but damn it's hard when the devil playing his card. You either claim you insane or they slam the bars. Last stand on the cross in the land of the lost. I'm a man, I'm a boss, I'm a battle to